I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. We're going to start with the afternoon sessions now. Thanks. My name is Sarah Earhart. I'm the Associate Director for Japan here at the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago. And before I welcome our next speaker, I would just like to remind everybody that tomorrow afternoon during lunch, I will be doing a presentation downstairs in room 106 on resources for educators about teaching the March 11th earthquake, tsunami, and ensuing nuclear disaster in Japan. So please feel free to grab your lunch, grab a plate, and then come. We have there's a lot of resources on the web about this, and I've compiled them into handy and easy to navigate lists. So our next speaker is Yuki Miyamoto. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago and is now Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies here in Chicago at DePaul University. Her first book was Beyond the Mushroom Cloud: Commemoration, Religion, and Responsibility After Hiroshima. Professor Miyamoto has continued to work on issues concerning discrimination and radiation. Her recent research focuses on Minamata disease in the wake of Fukushima. She has led 4 study abroad programs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and was appointed as Nagasaki Peace Correspondent in 2010 and Hiroshima Peace Ambassador in 2011. Please join me in welcoming Yuki Miyamoto.
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice, kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on discrimination, disaster, and disease. I'm especially grateful to Sarah Earhart, Associate Director for Japan at the Center for East Asian Studies, for inviting me to the Institute today, and to Andy Grant, Assistant Director for the International Studies, for organizing this seminar. I'm also indebted today's talk to Norma Field, Professor Emerita at the University of Chicago, and the group called Imagine, formed by her initiation. Today, I will talk primarily about events that took place over 50 years ago at Hiroshima and Minamata, Japan, which is known for the methylmercury disease that now bears the city's name. But in looking at these events and their victims, I also have in mind the plight of those who have suffered in the wake of more than 2,000 nuclear tests in Nevada, the Marshall Islands, Semipalatinsk, and across the globe. I'm also thinking of the victims of radiation leaks in Hanford, Washington, Rocky Flats, Colorado, and Tokaimura, Japan. I am remembering victims from the explosion of the nuclear reactors in Fukushima also, and I have in mind particularly the recent death, actually he passed away 2 days ago, of Masao Yoshida, who succumbed to cancer following his involvement in attempting to control the crippled nuclear reactors at Fukushima. While the disasters like Fukushima or nuclear explosion, nuclear tests, at first glance, natural disasters. In fact, they also involve while the disasters like Fukushima appear at first glance natural disasters because involved tsunami and earthquake. In fact, they also involve humans. They are tragedies born of human negligence as well as the force of nature. As Timothy S. George states, there may really be no purely natural disasters. And to be sure, the full scope of the disaster, its origins and its outcomes include the products of human civilization, while the aftermath of and response to the natural disasters invariably involve human intentions and actions. Harada Masazumi, a medical doctor. By the way, before moving on, I have some slides, but my understanding is for the first 40 minutes I will give a presentation and I will take questions from the floor, but if I'm not clear or if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me. Harada Masazumi, a medical doctor who devoted his life to raising awareness of the plight of the Minamata patients suffering from mercury poisoning, once stated that environmental pollution takes place where people are already discriminated against. Today, by way of examining possibilities for engaging disasters, I want to focus on the environmental pollution of methyl mercury that contaminated the city of Minamata, Kumamoto Prefecture. I have a map here. Kumamoto Prefecture in the southern island of Kyushu. I place focus here because the case epitomizes the dark side of Japan's modernization. Examining this case reveals a fundamental problem with Japanese modern society and perhaps any other industrialized society. Such societies are organized around discriminatory systems. In the case of Minamata, one finds discrimination in the form of neglect of patients and the natural environment on the part of the central and local governments, the Chiso Corporation factory, which released the contaminated water, and the workers and local communities within Minamata. Investigating this case will help us to understand the cruelty of the sacrificial system from which modern societies both benefit and suffer. In particular, I want to consider reactions that have taken the form of discrimination. Like Harada, I believe the conditions that lead to disaster and environmental pollution, as well as responses to them, frequently evidence forms of discrimination that themselves reflect a given society's value system. Discrimination and the prevailing value system of a society go hand in hand. For discrimination is one manner in which a society is ordered around its key values. My hope today and going forward is that we think about ways in which this link might be undone, making way for a more just social order that does not rely upon discrimination. Discerning the discriminatory conditions that give rise to pollution and disaster, as well as the discriminatory responses to victims of disasters, is a first step toward reconfiguring the present order through which discrimination, pollution, and disaster are perpetuated. As I will explain in further detail in a moment, the Minamata case exhibits an uncanny resemblance to the Fukushima disaster despite the geographical distances as you see here. Although we may not hear as much about Fukushima now as we did 2 years ago, the radiation leakage there is an ongoing problem. Just recently, Just recently, 600,000 becquerel of radioactive tritium was found in the water leaking from the crippled reactors of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which melted down after the earthquake and tsunami on March 11, 2011. My hope is that revisiting the still ongoing Minamata case, including the incurable disease, the issue of compensation for the patients, the initial denial of the disease by medical authorities, governments, and the Chiso Corporation, will suggest ways of reconceptualizing the social order that provides the condition under which such disasters occur. In other words, engaging crisis is not simply to restore the order. That does not mean that I do not respect those people who are engaged in relief work On the contrary, I admire them providing necessary products or everyday life necessary stuff to the people who suffered from the disaster. But eventually, we have to think about restructure society in order to avoid further crisis or further disaster. And perhaps we educators might be able to provide a new vision of a society. In treating the ongoing cases of Minamata and Fukushima, I will draw upon insights from Hibakusha, victims of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, just to put into context the discrimination against those who were exposed to radiation. Which is unfortunately becoming a problem, big problems in Fukushima and elsewhere in Japan. So, those people who are called Hibakusha, the victims of the atomic bombings, who were shunned and discriminated against precisely because of their exposure to radiation. But first, let me turn to Minamata disease here, what Minamata disease is about. This is another map showing you, so this is the Minamata port, this is the Shiranui inland sea. So this is Chiso factory, this is the train station, and this is the place where Chiso factory was releasing the contaminated water. So therefore, so this is once again, this is the Chiso factory, and releasing the water, the contaminated water flows into this sea. And the number here is the number of the patients, Minamata disease patients. And let me explain what Minamata disease is about. Minamata disease is caused by the ingestion of methyl mercury that was released for more than 3 decades, beginning in 1932 until 1968, from a factory owned by the Chiso Corporation. Mercury flowed into the Shiranui Sea, where the mercury accumulated in and eventually damaged or destroyed the natural environment, including fish and seashells. And people who are living along the coastline, they were not only catching the fish for making living, but also they are eating those fish. That the fish is staple for them. And eventually damaged, where am I? This mercury flowed into the Shiranui Sea, where the mercury accumulated in and eventually damaged or destroyed. And I will talk about how it happens in human body, as well as animals. The natural environment, so therefore, so this is the bioaccumulation, and perhaps you are familiar with what it's like. And this is showing where mercury tends to accumulate in human bodies. And not that I'm familiar with anatomy, but I just thought that maybe just visual aid might help you why people's body loses controls over. Because mercury enters the human body, when mercury enters the human body and accumulates to a sufficient degree, it affects the nervous system, paralyzing the tongue, fingers, and legs. And it starts with the tips of hands or feet, the body, the tip of the body, until one eventually loses control all over one's own body, leading to death. Not all the patients die from this methylmercury. Some patients live longer than others, but they show this paralysis. They are losing control over their bodies. In Minamata, for example, only between 1955 and 1959, which is only 4 years, more than 200 prenatally exposed infants were born with the disease. So it's not just adults who are eating fish, but also those fetus were affected. Yes? What's the percentage of birth? Among the, it depends. I do not have the data or how many babies were born throughout Japan or throughout the city, so it is hard to say at this point. But I can probably easily pull up the numbers later. 200 prenatally exposed. And then I have the number of the Minamata city, which is rapidly increased during the early 20th centuries, and I will talk about it. But before that, it's a small fishing village. So I will go back. I will talk about the history of this city in a minute. But in the meantime, let me continue. Minamata disease was officially discovered in 1956. And I would like to remind you that when the Chiso Corporation started releasing the contaminated water, which was 1932, so therefore at least over 2 decades, people were knowing something wrong, people were saying something wrong and showing actually bizarre symptoms, but officially discovered was in 1956. And after that, still the national government was trying to downplay, which I also touch upon later. But among the residents, these symptoms, like people started numbing, had been long observed as early as 1942. And sorry, I saw a hand over there.
I was wondering what constitutes official discovery.
Oh, right. Official discovery is there are a couple of things constitutes official discovery. But here, what I mean by that is that the doctor's statement, together with the national government's public statement. And the national governments have this Ministry of Health, so they are the ones who are in charge. They formed this survey team because they were informed that something going on over there that can be contagious disease. So they formed a team, survey team, and dispatched those people and got into tried to collect data. But actually this survey team didn't last long. They lasted only 1 year. And at the end of that year, they finally decided, okay, so this is because of methylmercury. This is not a kind of contagious disease through, mosquitoes or other kinds of disease. However, they still did not say where this methylmercury came from for a long time, and they wanted to protect the Chiso Corporation. And there is the reason, which I would like to touch upon later. So, as early as 1942, the abnormality was first seen among cats. And actually back then, and especially through the coastline, there are so many rats and mice issues. So therefore, lots of families actually keep cats. They are not inside home cats, but they were having cats, and cats were roaming around. And those cats were fed the fish, fresh fish from the sea, the same food that people were eating. And they are the ones who first showed these symptoms. And I would like to show a video what it's like when you loses the control over. And I'm supposed... Okay, suppose this is not the one which I want to show. I don't know what happened, sorry. Not this happy one, unfortunately.
It's our musical interlude.
Oh, this is it, thank you. This is a short video, but...
시대오가 이기기는 그대로 해결하는 겁니다. 시대오가 이기가 다시 닥치면 되게 나시다.
So there was a short video, and there's a great photo book called Minamata, which is unfortunately out of print. And there are many photos and history. But you can imagine. Oh, sure. And how am I gonna? I forgot. Sorry. Oh, right, current. And then, thank you. So as you saw, if cats were losing their bodies, you saw that the cats were leaking saliva and apparently lost control over their bodies. You can imagine what would happen to human bodies. And then the next one is. So, but interestingly, I would like to trace the history of Japan as well as this small city, Minamata. It was a small village in 1868. And 1868 is, roughly speaking, considered as the year that Japan modernized itself, or at least Japan tried to modernize itself as a modern nation state, and also Westernization, so-called, began in Japan. And so Minamata, because it's a small city facing the sea, they were known for producing salt, but they also had a coal, some of the coal. People make living also by transporting the salt and coal, besides small-scale fishing and farming. This changed drastically in 1904, and interestingly, the 1904 is Russo-Japan War. As you can see that right after Japan modernized itself, Japan engaged in successive war, almost 10 years apart. And this 1904 Russo-Japan War drastically changed their fate. What I mean by that is, the Japanese government monopolized and rationalized the salt production and sales to help cover the huge costs of the Russo-Japan War. And actually this monopolization of salt continued until 1997. But because of this monopolization, people in Minamata were not able to sell or produce and sell salt. And also, nearby region, there was a gold mine and coal mine, much bigger than Minamata ones, were discovered. And so they had more investment, they had more capital. So Minamata was completely skipped over. So they were producing gold and coal, and this was shipped throughout Japan, skipping Minamata port. So Minamata was struggling economically. And he is the guy who also built, he was born in Kanazawa, graduated from Tokyo Imperial University, so one of the elites back then. He was born, his family is traced back to samurai warrior class. So he is one of the elite person. He built this hydroelectric power plant in this gold mine near Minamata. And Minamata is now sinking economically, having a hard time. So they actually asked Noguchi to help them. And Noguchi decided to build some chemical company there. So ironically, this chemical company became later Chiso Corporation, which caused the afflictions among residents in Minamata. And Noguchi's corporation steadily grew and actually became one of the third largest companies or corporation in Japan. But also, this is what was going on in Japan. But in the meantime, as a newly emerged corporation, Noguchi was heavily investing in Korea or Manchuria, Manchuria is the northeast of China continent, and Korean Peninsula. Those became under the Japanese control, Japanese military control. And all the establishment were kind of scared to invest too much on those areas. But since Noguchi was a newly emerged corporate star, he decided to invest heavily. So at some point, 25% of investment in those colonies of Japan came from Noguchi's corporation. So here it is. It started with electric power. And so it's an uncanny link to Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, because that's also generating power, electric power. And then that electric power began with Japan's modernization, industrialization, which also began with colonization. And colonization and modernization are hand in hand, especially in this case of Chiso Corporation. Chiso Corporation grew, became bigger because of the investment in those colonized areas. And methyl mercury, and in the meantime, and so at one point, Noguchi's factory in Minamata shifted from chemical, more like synthetic chemical companies. Well, it started with carbine factory, and then now shifted more like synthetic chemical production, such as acetic acid and carcinogenic acetaldehyde. Sorry, I don't know how to say it. acetaldehyde, kind of chemical, which amounted to 50% of domestic production by 1935. So apparently, before 1945, Chiso was producing lots of chemical stuff, which was depended upon by Japanese other factories, other industries in Japan, which continued after 1945. But in the process, altogether, 5 tons of methyl mercury. In that process, the Chiso started using methyl mercury and just started releasing methyl mercury in the water, and altogether 5 tons of methyl mercury was released. And the amount could kill this many people, or could cause 2 billion people the Minamata disease. So going back to this discovery of the disease, the Minister of Health and Welfare first ordered to dispatch the survey group, but then soon ordered to dissolve it. But in the meantime, the Kumamoto University president or the dean of the School of Medicine, those people knew that methyl mercury is the cause of the disease, and also that came from the Chiso Corporation. So they were pursuing the Chiso Corporation. They were pursuing, appealing the Chiso Corporation to stop releasing the water. However, they made an announcement, these doctors made an announcement, quote, "It is lamentable that we cannot carry out a scientific study since the factory refuses to allow us to collect the samples of its effluents. We will draw a conclusion in the near future on the process by which inorganic mercury becomes organic mercury in the bodies of fish and shellfish." So in other words, the Chiso Corporation refuses to give water samples to those doctors, and the local communities were divided because some of them were working for the Chiso Corporation and others were not. And the city was, of course, protecting the Chiso Corporation because the Chiso Corporation is the source of steady income to the city and the national government as well. So there were many divides, and finally lawsuits began. But I also want to talk about Dr. Harada once again, going back to him. He actually found the prenatal exposure to methyl mercury causing the Minamata disease to newborn babies, which was not the theory back then. Medical community was saying that mother's placenta should protect the babies. That's the thesis, but however, Harada proved them wrong. So therefore, those theses were just a hypothesis. From this experience, Harada states, the way in which we can gain knowledge comes from no one but patience. And then he talks about how we scientists have to maintain humility, otherwise we could cause a lot of damage to society. And I also talk about here, I also want to talk about Eileen Miyoko Smith. She spent time in Minamata and she's very active in lawsuits on the side of the Minamata patients. And her late husband, Eugene Smith, is the ones who took the photos, which is now circulating here. Recently pointed out, in both Minamata and Fukushima, what the government did was to first sow confusion about the cause, because for a while the government was not admitting that methyl mercury is the cause of the disease. And even after they admitted to it, they said, well, we don't know where that comes from. What the government did was to first sow confusion about the cause. In Minamata, the question was, could it be mercury poisoning? The government said no, and even got some professor to say it could have been bombs dropped in Minamata Bay that were now leaking. So this link between Minamata and Fukushima, this is Eileen Miyoko Smith. 10 strategies taken by the state, prefectural governments, academic flunkies, and companies in the cases of Minamata and Fukushima. So the first one is, do not take responsibility, use sectionalism to pin blame on others. So everyone is blaming each other. The Chiso Corporation is blaming the city is blaming the workers or the national government. Number 2, confuse victims and public opinion. Number 3, position victims in conflict with each other. Do not, and all these, as you can see, is actually happening in Fukushima, unfortunately. Number 5, stall for time. Number 6, conduct tests or surveys that will produce underestimated results on damage. And as Harada says, those theories are most likely hypotheses. And as I mentioned earlier, in the beginning, in the beginning of this talk, the person who was in charge at Fukushima, Yoshida, he passed away from cancer. But official statement was that that has nothing to do with him involved in Fukushima accident, and which probably cannot be proven with scientific measure. However, until it is proven, his disease has nothing to do with radiation, or his cancer has nothing to do with his involvement in Fukushima accident, is also a hypothesis. But somehow coming from the national government, it sounds like it's the thesis. Number 7, wear victims down until they give up. 8, create an official certification system that narrows down victim numbers. So all those issues were very uncannily similar to what's going on in Fukushima. So therefore, in order to prevent further accidents, I would like to argue that we are not just restoring the order, but also we have to restructure or re-envision a society. Because especially both Minamata and Fukushima, it started as economic difficulties of this area, and they are the ones who invited this big corporation. In the case of Fukushima, in case of Minamata, that's a Chiso Corporation. In case of Fukushima, that's TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Companies. So therefore, economic reason, that's definitely one. But also, in order to, so therefore, there is the, this is what Japanese philosopher Takahashi Tetsuya describes as the system of sacrifice, sacrificial system. Those people who are underprivileged tends to be victimized. But it wouldn't be seen as clearly until something happens. But we probably cannot afford another nuclear power plant accident or any other accidents. So therefore, now I would like to move on to discrimination afterwards. But I would also like to remind you that the discrimination against the hibakusha, which is actually enforces the existing discrimination pattern. It's not because they were attacked by the atomic bombing, so now all of a sudden they became victims of discrimination. Rather, because there were a discriminatory system and this atomic bombing happens, so they were further discriminated against. And it's partly because of the censorship, the withholding the information, which also happened in Minamata, which is also happening in Fukushima as well. But I'm a little bit time conscious, so I'm skipping this part and move on to various forms of discrimination. As you can imagine, employment and marriage, those are the biggest time when discrimination became very pronounced. And especially marriage, it might be difficult for us to think about why marriage is difficult, but I would like to talk about it in a minute. There are a couple of examples. A college student in Tokyo expelled from a boarding house because his brother was hospitalized in Hiroshima atomic bomb hospital. And that happened in the 60s, so about 10-15 years later. 1970s, medical doctor and member of the Tokyo Cosmopolitan Assembly, Kondo Nobuyoshi, proposed the sterilization of hibakusha. This bill didn't go through, thankfully. 1983, then Prime Minister Nakasone, he visited the nursery home and then told them sickness is a product of your spirit. If you cheer up yourself, then sickness is gone. So he clearly does not understand radiation sickness at all. And this is partially because of the withholding information, but partially because of already discriminated social system there, which I will touch upon soon. Discriminated against women, this is something I was touching upon earlier, especially in Japan during this time period in 1940s and 50s, or a little bit before too. Women are often considered as the carrier of the babies, and especially having a male baby is important to maintain the family name. So therefore, for example, hibakusha is the atomic bomb victims. Their testimonies often reveal that when it comes to marriage and childbearing, the health of women is much more a concern than that of their male counterparts, as if children's health is solely women's responsibility. So therefore, they are facing more severe discrimination against, they meaning women, hibakusha women. But this is because women were already discriminated against. And other literature and film which depicts discrimination is this one is recent, so therefore it deals with more recent concerns, which is the discrimination against the second generation. This was a comic book or a graphic novel, but in 2007 it was made into a film. Another one is Barefoot Gang, which might be known. But this is a good text because this talks about how violent society was in general in 1945. The police officers were always on the street watching over and beating up people, mostly for no reason, which was well depicted. But also, this graphic novel depicts Korean victims. And according to Lisa Yoneyama, anthropologist, 20,000 to 30,000 Koreans, people who came from Korea, were forced to come to Japan because of economic reasons, or forced labor, were dead from the atomic bombing, which constitutes 10 to 20% of the entire victims of the bombing, but which was not so much talked about. And there are other forms against the Roman Catholic, because in Nagasaki, the headquarters of Japan's Roman Catholic, that's the city, main city of Japanese Roman Catholics. But interestingly, in Nagasaki, some would say all the residents of Nagasaki once reportedly and ungenerously quipped that the bomb was not dropped on Nagasaki, it was dropped on Urakami, which is the Catholic community. Reference to the particular neighborhood suffering the worst damage, and coincidentally, since the bomb was dropped off target, so therefore, they were an interesting Roman Catholic community and this Burakumin, which is a kind of outcast. Those two communities were put next to each other so that they are keeping an eye on each other instead of being against the authority. So therefore, here, Ian Burma, who is a journalist, once wrote, "It was as if a bomb had destroyed Harlem and, like the rest of Manhattan, unscathed." And because of this, in Nagasaki, it is said that the peace movement was a little bit tamed compared to Hiroshima. So there was some kind of discriminatory treatments of people which affects aftermath of the disaster. And similar, going back to Minamata, this is similar, discrimination against the fishing community in Japan. And one author says that fishing community was in general discriminated against in Japan, partly because of this Buddhist teaching. In Buddhism, you are not supposed to kill living beings, so therefore fishing community is often ranked a little lower. I have to look into more if that's the case in the 20th century. But apparently fishing community has its own distinctive culture, which is also fascinating. And after the Minamata disease, avoiding fish and food, it's not even fish, but sometimes the tangerines, Minamata is also known for tangerines, they were also avoided in the market. This is called harmful rumor, which is exactly what's going on in Fukushima. Divide the Minamata citizens, workers versus non-workers, and even workers for Chiso Corporation, they were showing the Minamata disease symptoms, but they did not admit. A lot of them did not admit. Some of them came out and talked about how difficult it is for them to admit it, as if they were betraying the Chiso Corporation. And denial, downplaying. And lastly, Ogata Masato. So what is going on here is that beginning of the modernization and the industrialization, the society, this system is so much embedded in this society. So therefore, everyone is a victim and everyone is a victimizer at the same time, to some extent. Of course, the degree of responsibility is different. And Ogata is one of the patients, Minamata patients. But then one day he realized that he is actually surrounded by the products that Chiso Corporation created. And back then, Chiso, in 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the Chiso was producing some raw ingredients for plastic material. And in our everyday life, it is extremely hard to avoid plastic materials or plastic products. And so he realized that my life is also supported by the Chiso Corporation. What does that mean? So then he realized, I'm a Chiso too. And after that, he actually withdrew from the lawsuit, civil action, refused the compensation money, and just thinking, he's still thinking what he could do or what we all could do. But also he thinks that the idea of assuming responsibility is an illusion. And I feel like Ogata is right. For the irrevocable damage to humans like Minamata and the environment like Fukushima, both humans and the environment in Minamata and Fukushima, responsibility sounds hollow. But then what shall we do? And that's the ongoing issues, and I have not found the answer. But at least what we could do is to see where those things, those even natural disaster takes place. And I hope that I made it clear that I am also agreeing with Timothy George, who is saying that there is no pure natural disaster. And when we think about Hurricane Katrina, that might be easier to understand. So what we could do is perhaps to think about to restructure of this society, and at least hopefully we can eliminate any kind of discriminatory treatment of others. But at least we might want to start with decreasing that such treatment, so that we may be able to decrease the disaster as well, the degree of disaster as well. That's my hope. And finally, I would like to show texts on Minamata articles. Those 3 articles I have already notified the organizers, so they are available online. Video. Here is a very good video, and actually a month ago or so, the doc film was showing this video. This is about the Minamata patients. There are many books, but there are many books about Minamata in Japanese. But I picked up the ones which are available in English translation, and especially Ogata Masato. He's a patient, but he is a philosopher. He's thinking deeply about this system of society and discriminatory system in this society. If you have questions, I would like to take them.
Grab the microphone.
Sure.
Questions for Professor Miyamoto?
Thank you. First, that your list of 10 things that the government did, you could attach that to probably any major disaster that's ever happened. It was awesome. With Fukushima, how honest, how forthcoming do you think the government has been, and how well are they trusted now?
The first one is how well trusted now? That's the second question. The first one,
do the people in the area believe what they hear from the government?
Well, the difficulty is that I cannot speak for them. Some of them may want to believe, because it is so hard for them to face the reality. The reality is, to me, my reality is that they are not supposed to be there. They should leave. But then their life, everyday life, the land which they inherited many generations ago, and just getting rid of it, abandoning it, must be very difficult. So some of them might know that it might not be the best, but some of them are actually trying. If you are interested, I think like tomorrow, Aiko Kojima is talking about the farmers in the area, so she will give you more detailed information on that. But also it's peer pressure always, that's also universal. If one is leaving, then that means like the rest feels abandoned. And what does that mean? That means someone can afford leaving. So there is always some kind of conflict. Yeah.
Sorry, if I can actually just add one thing to that as well. We'll be talking about this during my teacher resources lunch tomorrow, but one of the major issues is that the government is actually not in charge of what's going on at Fukushima right now, right? It's still under control of TEPCO, the power company, which I saw an article in the Japan Times just yesterday or the day before, has just measured cesium and tritium levels that are through the roof in the wells underneath the first reactor, and they can't explain why. So, that's a problem, but there's also a fascinating progression in the news and in the English language literature that we can go over tomorrow that talks about, that documents the misinformation and disinformation that has been propagated by TEPCO and by the government about the Fukushima disaster. Do you want to add anything to that?
Technically, TEPCO is now owned by the government, but we don't see any kind of national government's involvement. It seems like TEPCO is autonomously, as if there was no change. And so that is true. And constantly they are changing the information. So therefore it's not like misinformation. We are not misleading you. We just made mistakes. So still constantly they are changing the data, the numbers, figures, which is, I would like to also draw your attention to the Atomic Age website, which Norma Field and I and some other friends are updating. So if you are interested, please check that website.
So I'm sensing there's a theme today about sources of energy, and earlier we talked about some of the pitfalls with fracking. Can you talk more directly about your thoughts on nuclear power? Just beyond Fukushima, just in general.
Like pro and con, or am I against?
Is the idea of safe nuclear power, is that a real idea or is it not?
I've been involved with anti-nuclear movements, and it started with my concerns for radiation. It started with my concern with the nuclear bombs, actually. But the more I study about nuclear weapons, as I touched upon very briefly in the beginning, that there are more than 2,000 nuclear bombs were tested all over the world, but the U.S. alone, 1,032 tests were conducted. And where were they conducted? And that's the theme of today's talk, the place where, and this is not just the U.S., but any countries which have tested the nuclear weapons, they chose the place where the minorities of that country resides. And I often ask my students that, isn't that an interesting coincidence? And of course it's not a coincidence, it's a deliberate choice. So therefore discrimination, they were already discriminated against because of their political power. They do not have political power, underprivileged, and those are the places where chosen as the test site, which means that's probably not safe. And sure enough, they were not. So people are still suffering. So that concern for radiation victims also leads to nuclear power plants as well. It's I believe that it is leaking, and also from the very beginning, who is working for the uranium mine and how their safety is guaranteed, and how the uranium is, or plutonium, how the uranium is transported, how safe is it, who is actually transporting it, and all those things made me think that nuclear power is not a viable option. Of course, economically nowadays people are saying it's not economically viable, but for me it's more like humanistic concerns.
Earlier, you, along with that same topic of the discrimination, you earlier alluded to that the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki because of the Roman Catholic community. Did I interpret that correctly?
Yes.
What was the U.S.'s official position on why they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki?
Right. Well, thank you for that question, because that was not a deliberate choice on the U.S. side. That was more like because Nagasaki was not the target, not the original target. The original target was called Kokura, which was I don't know exact numbers, but kind of the other side of the Kyushu island, which actually Minamata is on. But the reason was the plane went to Kokura, but it was so crowded, and they were ordered not to use the radar, so the visibility was the issue for them. So they had three choices at that point. One, drop it anyway, or bring it back to the base, which is kind of crazy, right? Too dangerous. Third, go to the second target, which happens to be Nagasaki.
And if I may add one final question. So it seems that the victims of the Miyamoto mercury poisoning really had to struggle for a long period of time in order to receive treatment, much less acknowledgement and reparation from officials in Japan at a variety of levels. And I'm curious whether those afflicted by Fukushima have learned lessons or drawn parallels between their own plight, maybe devised strategies drawing upon the Miyamoto, Minamata case and their own efforts to gain acknowledgement and reparation from officials in the government in Japan?
Yes, definitely. People are trying. Like Eileen Miyoko Smith, she's one of the person who was involved in the Minamata case, so she's also helping people in Fukushima as well. And people are making comparisons and trying to learn from Minamata, but the problem is that Minamata itself is not completely solved yet. There are some people who are still appealing. There are people who are showing the symptoms, but they were not eligible for, and then that's one of the strategies among 10 strategies that the government defines who the victims are, and if you happen to fill that requirements or criteria, then you are not victims. And often the case, it is hard to prove, and that's the same as any kind of disaster, I suppose. It's extremely hard to prove that you are victims, and somehow that's victims' task. Victims themselves have to prove that they are victims, not the other way around. Victimizers should prove, but somehow that's a victim's task.
Well, thank you very much, and let us thank Professor Miyamoto.
Thank you.